Our next 4 sessions focus on key terms in the counseling field that are the basis for understanding the field and providing effective counseling and ministry. These terms are crisis, trauma, loss, and grief. Sometimes you will find these terms used interchangeably as if they are synonyms of each other. While these terms are interrelated, I believe each of these terms represents different, distinct processes, each important to understand. Making sense out of these terms and understanding the processes related help the caregiver be prepared to offer the most effective interventions. The first term that we will consider is crisis. We will look at the definitions of crisis, what kinds of crises show up in the Bible, and what factors determine the impact of a crisis event. Generally, when you hear the word crisis, it denotes something bad. If you ask others whether a crisis is a good thing or a bad thing, most individuals will see it as a negative. The term crisis is used broadly in everyday language, and it can mean an extreme event like raging fires in the western U.S., or it could mean that a person's favorite Starbucks is closed for repair as they are running late to their morning meeting. For those who attempt to define crisis, there tend to be a couple of types of definition. The first type is crisis as a problematic state. Researchers such as Everly and Mitchell and H. Norm Wright see crisis as this type of problematic state. The second definition is crisis as a turning point. Oden, James, and Gilliland are writers who go by this type of definition. In this definition, a crisis can turn either in a good direction or a bad direction. My preferred definition comes from a writer named Christy Cannell, who says that a crisis has 3 components. First, there is some precipitating event, and the event can be a real event or something that is just perceived. Second, the person's perception of the event causes distress. Cannell believes that the person's perception is especially important to understanding the crisis and in what intervention a helper might use. Number 3, the person then experiences a challenge to or a failure in their usual coping mechanisms. The specific word crisis doesn't appear in the Bible, but there are many terms that parallel or convey the idea of crisis. Some of these terms include trial, tribulation, test, persecution, affliction, suffering, adversity, pain, and perhaps others that come to mind. The Bible identifies many individuals in crisis, including Adam and Eve, Jacob, Moses and his family, David, Esther, Daniel, Jeremiah, Mary and Joseph, the disciples, and Paul. In the Old Testament, the nation of Israel seems to commonly be in crisis. In the New Testament, we see many individuals and families seeking Jesus for healing from various crises that these families are facing. One might even ask the question of whether or not Jesus experiences a type of crisis as he prays in the garden before his crucifixion. Scripture presents a picture of crises being a part of life. Sometimes it is the result of our own sin, sometimes it is the result of other people's sin, and on some occasions it is the result of following God. It is possible to follow God with all of your heart and to still end up in crisis. The Bible is very clear that God knows of the crises we experience. God is with us during these times, and God is able to help us overcome and grow from many of the crises we face. Trusting in God's goodness and in His character is key to navigating through crises. So, what factors determine the impact of a crisis? Ultimately, in order to help a person in crisis, it is important to understand the nature of the crisis that is taking place. To determine the impact of crisis, whether it will be positive or negative, I think that the formula looks something like this. The nature of the crisis event plus the person in the crisis, both work together to equal whether or not there is a positive or negative impact from the crisis. So let's look at each of those in a little bit more detail. The nature of the crisis event is the first factor contributing to the impact of crisis. A crisis event, for instance, can be gradual or sudden. A gradual crisis might be a slowly developing health concern that a person is experiencing. A sudden crisis would be a stroke which occurs with little or no warning. A crisis can range in severity from minor to severe. A flat tire, on the whole, is really a relatively minor crisis. A car wreck with injuries is a more severe crisis. A crisis can be brief or of extended duration. A beloved pet that may be missing for half an hour but found in the next neighborhood would be an example of a very brief crisis. Hurricanes Katrina and Harvey were extended crises lasting over several days and even weeks for some who experienced it. Some crises may even go to the point of lasting over years. Crises are capable of producing losses. Some crises don't result in loss. The crisis happens, then it resolves, and nothing is truly lost. Other crises, however, produce multiple extensive losses. Crises that are severe, are extended in duration, and produce multiple losses tend to be the most impactful. The second factor in the impact of crisis is the person who's in the crisis. Each person enters a crisis event with a set of coping skills. Some individuals have weak, ineffective, or unhelpful coping skills. Other individuals draw on their personal strengths, have effective means of coping, and are quite resilient. Some individuals even thrive in crises. ER physicians, fighter pilots, athletes would be examples of some individuals who thrive on crises. Individuals vary greatly in how they perceive potential crisis events. One person can view a crisis event as devastating and unwinnable. Another person can actually view the same crisis as a challenge. Some crises are not real, but a person may perceive them to be real. Understanding a person's perspective is very important to helping the person cope with and go through the crisis. Individuals have differing levels of support during and following crises. Some individuals have little to no friend, family, coworker, neighbor, or church family support. Other individuals have extensive, healthy support networks. Individuals have varying numbers of associated stressors. Some people enter a crisis situation with few other stressors taking place in their life. Other individuals enter a crisis already challenged and even depleted by other life stressors. Individuals have the best chance of navigating crises if they have good coping skills, strong family and friend support, and if they aren't depleted from other excessive types of stressors. If an individual perceives crises in an accurate manner and views the situation as a challenge, they are more likely to have a good outcome with the crisis. Thus, the nature of the crisis situation and the makeup of the person facing the crisis intermix to play a strong role in whether or not the person will have a positive or negative outcome from the crisis. Crises are not unusual. In fact, crises seem to be a part of being human. Some individuals seem more adept at facing and working through crises. Some individuals seem overwhelmed, even by what appears to be a rather minor type of crisis. When caregivers work with individuals in crisis, it is important to understand the nature of the crisis and to assess the strengths and vulnerabilities of the person who has encountered the crisis. In our next session, we will address the second key term of trauma.